Last week, we noted that there are some topics that we hear sermons on that we think, we don't really need to hear about that. Things like murder and adultery, they're things that they're so far removed from me that I really don't need to hear that kind of lesson. People think that way about certain topics. We discussed that last week, and how even the way Jesus brings these sermons is he brings them, even those topics that we think are irrelevant to us, Jesus brings them to a point where they are extremely relevant to everyone who hears them. But just like there are some topics that we think we don't need to hear, there are other topics that we just simply don't want to hear. There are some topics that we just don't like. Some topics that are difficult or sensitive, or topics that make us feel uncomfortable. Topics that are so applicable to our lives that we don't want to hear about them. Topics that cause us to struggle. Sure, murder isn't hugely applicable to me, but at least it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable. At least hearing a sermon about murder makes me go, okay, I won't do that then. But the topics of divorce and topics like oaths, these are ones that are often sensitive and difficult. Because in today's world, divorce affects most people. Perhaps not personally, perhaps not in your own life, but people you know. A lot of people are going to be affected by divorce, whether that be siblings or parents or friends. Whatever it is, we're surrounded by divorce in today's culture. Maybe people we look up to, maybe not our parents, but maybe some older mentors of us. We see divorce happening all over the place in this world. I think many of us here have either seen it or almost seen it, whether that be personally or someone we know, or we've seen someone go through this, and we know the hurt that it causes. We know the damage that divorce causes, the pain that comes with it. Likewise with oaths, it's something that a lot of Christians really struggle with. When we look at passages like Jesus presents it here, we think, how am I supposed to apply this? How do I live this out? People struggle with these sorts of topics. And I went through this week and I was studying this passage. I said to Daniel, I think I'm going to be sick on Sunday. I think you should take this one. As we study these passages and as I studied through them, it becomes so clear how high of a calling Jesus expects of Christians. How high of a calling Jesus presents in the Sermon on the Mount when it comes to the life of the Christian, when it comes to kingdom living. Because I thought to myself, okay, well, it's obviously going to be a difficult topic. I'm just going to try and I'm not going to deal with this aspect of it or that aspect of it. I'm just going to deal with what the text says. And then as I did that, I was like, that's worse. That's even harder. Jesus has a very high calling for Christians. And it's such a high calling, especially with regards to divorce and marriage, that it's very hard for people to hear and even harder for people to accept. When this was expounded by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, we'll look at this throughout the lesson. But in Matthew chapter 19, verse 10, when the disciples had just heard Jesus teaching on divorce, they said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it's better not to marry. That's such a high calling. That's such a high expectation of us. That's so difficult to accept. What we're going to see in this lesson this morning is that Jesus calls us to be a people of commitment, of fidelity and integrity. In both divorce and oaths in his teaching here, he calls us to be a people of commitment, fidelity and integrity. What I'm going to do this morning is we're going to follow the same structure that we've looked at these sections, and we're going to continue to look at this section of Scripture, where we're going to look at the law and its interpretation at the time, and then we're going to see Jesus provide the fullness of the law. So the law and its interpretation and the fullness of the law. So let's get into our text this morning. Let's begin in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 31, where Jesus provides the law and its interpretation. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. This is Jesus again providing one of his antitheses where he presents what the law says. He gives the law, or at least an interpretation of the law at the time. What Jesus is dealing with here is a very unique law. It is the only law in the Old Testament that deals with divorce. You think of how prevalent divorce is in today's culture and how much we talk about it, how much we teach about it. We kind of expect that under the Old Testament, with all the 613 laws that they have and all the intricacies of it, you'd expect there'd be quite a few laws about it. But there's actually only one law in the Old Testament that deals with divorce, and it's this in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1 to 4. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4. That says, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord God gives you as an inheritance." It's very interesting that this is the only law that deals with divorce in the Old Testament. It seems to be a very specific circumstance. It seems to be dealing with a very certain case. Because basically what this is in Deuteronomy 24 is this is merely a case law. This is a case law. It's what you do under certain circumstances. You see, when we look at the law of Moses and we look at Exodus to Numbers, we see in those passages God giving the law to the children of Israel. This is what I want you to do. This is what how I want you to live. These are the things that I want you to follow. These are the behaviors that I expect from you. But when we get to Deuteronomy, as we've just studied the book of Deuteronomy, right? When we get to the book of Deuteronomy, what this is, it's a reiteration of the law. It's the retelling of the law. The law is being given a second time to a new generation. You've had the wandering in the wilderness, and the people who were given the law initially have all died off, except for a few people. And then you have this re-giving of the law to a brand new generation. You're going to need to know the law too. So let's confirm what was already said in Exodus to Numbers. But as you read through Deuteronomy and you study Deuteronomy, you start to see there are actually a few laws that are unique. You see a few new laws that have come out from this. And what a lot of these laws are is they are case laws. They're laws that are often application of the law to a specific situation, or a law that's restricting existing practices. So God's given the law, and then you have Deuteronomy with a new generation of people, and he gives the law again, but he also says, but when you're doing these things, which I already know you're doing, this is how I want you to handle these situations. Under the circumstances that you find yourselves in, this is how I want you to live. Let's apply the law more specifically to the situation. And I believe that's what we find here in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1, where God gives a circumstance and how you are to behave in that circumstance. Notice what it says there. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. All of that is descriptive of a circumstance. None of that is a prescription of a practice. God is not saying this is what you need to do. If someone has indecency in the marriage, then you are to write a certificate of divorce and you are to put it in her hand and you are to send her from your house. That's not a command. This is dealing with a specific case. It's dealing with a specific circumstance. This law was added to restrict divorce and remarriage that was already going on in the nation of Israel. So what the Pharisees did with this, and what scribes and all the lawyers who interpreted the law, what they did with this is, rather than looking at the intention of the law, rather than looking at what the law was, they basically looked at it and said, what does indecency mean? How is it that I'm supposed to know when I should put away my wife? How is it I'm supposed to know when I should divorce my wife? Which is not the point of the verse at all, but that's the way that a lot of people interpreted it. And we kind of see this when we look at the traditions of the Pharisees, we look at the traditions of the Jews and the way they interpreted the law. Basically, there were two main schools of thought when it came to this verse. There were two main schools of interpretation when it came to the law. There was Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel. And basically, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, they would fall into one of these camps. Rabbi Shammai basically interpreted the law to say indecency refers to gross sexual indecency or immorality, though not necessarily adultery. And under those circumstances, you should put away your wife. Rabbi Hillel, on the other hand, he was a little more loose with the interpretation of the law. According to Rabbi Hillel, indecency goes beyond sin and can refer to any offense that the husband considers indecent. There are a few examples of what Rabbi Hillel gives for what could be considered indecent. If your wife cooks a meal improperly, accidentally, and serves it to you, she can be divorced. If she spoke to another man without her husband present, she can be divorced. If she spoke disrespectfully of the husband's parents in his presence, she could be divorced. If she spoke in an argumentative way that could be heard next door, she could be divorced. And this is really, this last one is really the heart of Hillel when we get to what he actually intended with these laws. According to Rabbi Hillel, if a husband finds someone else more attractive who pleases him better, he can divorce his wife. That's indecency in the eyes of Rabbi Hillel. Now, I want you to put yourself in the time, and put yourself in the mind of the Jewish people. Which do you think was more popular during the time of Jesus? At least among the men. Rabbi Hillel was the more popular opinion, but even Rabbi Shammai, even the more conservative and the more restrictive, he still was not as restrictive as Jesus when it came to this law. Both parties, the problem that both parties had is they believed that it was a religious duty to divorce a bad wife. So you put yourself in Rabbi Hillel's interpretive camp and you say, if my wife serves me a bad meal, I have a duty to put away that wife. It is my responsibility as a holy person, especially the Pharisees who wanted to be this really high standard of holiness. They said, I have a duty to divorce my wife if she doesn't please me as she's supposed to. If she speaks to another man, if she cooks a meal improperly, if she speaks disrespectfully about my parents, I have a duty to divorce my wife. And you can see that here, even in the way that Jesus quotes the verse here. In Matthew chapter 5, he says, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's not what Deuteronomy 24 says. Jesus isn't quoting the law exactly, he's providing the interpretation. It's not whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. The way Deuteronomy 24 says it is if he has found some indecency in her, and if he writes her a certificate of divorce, and if he puts it in her hand and sends her away from his house. It's circumstances. It's a description of what's going on in Israel and not a prescription of how they are to behave. But that's the way that the Pharisees took this. Deuteronomy 24 is dealing with regulating a divorce practice that is already taking place within Israel. The divorce of the marriage union, as we see here, is not an invention of God. Divorce is not something that God put into the law as something that you should do. All the law does is deals with the circumstances of a pre-existing divorce practice. the restriction of remarrying of your previous spouse, if she has remarried, that would be committing adultery. That's the way the Old Testament law was. That's the interpretation of the Old Testament law. But what Jesus does in verse 32 is he gives the fullness of the law. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The fullness of the law is that Jesus applies these same principles of the remarriage situation, and he applies it to any remarriage situation. He says, if any woman is wrongfully divorced and remarries, she commits adultery. If any man who marries a wrongfully divorced woman also commits adultery. Jesus is using the law to demonstrate the permanence of marriage, the significance of marriage. Jesus isn't trying to say here, all right, this is the list of exemptions. This is the list of clauses to your marriage. This is how you can get out of your marriage. Certainly he provides it. He does provide the clause, and we'll deal with that in a moment. But the point that Jesus is getting across here is that marriage is permanent. Marriage is sacred. Marriage is a covenant relationship. In that, he does present sexual immorality as the one concession to this, and the only exception clause to divorce that Jesus presents. But what we often do with this passage, and perhaps more significantly what the Pharisees did with this passage, is they looked at the law and they said, what's the exemption clause? What's my way of getting out of this? How can I be sure that when I make a marriage commitment, I'm not really committing? How do I make sure that I can get out of this if I want to? And this is perhaps clearer when Jesus expounds on this in Matthew chapter 19. If we look at Matthew chapter 19, beginning in verse 3. Matthew 19, from verse 3 down to verse 10. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." You see, when Jesus answers the question of the Pharisees, the question is asked, what reason can I divorce my wife? Give me a reason, any reason at all. Or perhaps they're saying here, can I just divorce my wife for any reason that enters my mind? Jesus doesn't say, well, this is the clause, this is the exemption, this is how you get out of your marriage. That's not how Jesus deals with this. What he does is he simply states the original and perfect definition of marriage. He gives it from the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. He talks about marriage being two individuals being inseparably joined together by God. The permanence of marriage. God designed marriage without a divorce clause. But then it continues. Verse 6, so they are joined, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Notice the wording there. Why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce? Moses did not command that. Moses certainly did not command to give her a certificate of divorce. That's the way, and we see that in the way Jesus responds here in verse 8. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, or sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Jesus, in the way he answers this question, he says divorce is something that man invented. And God allowed it. God is understanding. Because of our weakness, because of the fact that we're not like God. Because when we look at the Old Testament, And we see God's relationship with Israel that is regularly illustrated as a marriage covenant. We looked at that in Jeremiah chapter 3. We're going to look at it more when we get to the book of Hosea. But we see that God's relationship with Israel is regularly illustrated as a marriage covenant. And in these instances, God demonstrates his covenant faithfulness despite the unfaithfulness of Israel. He's saying that the nation of Israel is constantly committing this immorality, constantly going after other gods, constantly breaking the covenant. But God continues in faithfulness with them. He demonstrates his covenant faithfulness. God's ideal for marriage is, of course, that there's no unfaithfulness of any kind on either side of the marriage. God's ideal for marriage is, of course, that we keep the commitments. Both parties keep the commitments. But wherever there is unfaithfulness, God's desire is not divorce, but forgiveness and restoration. That's his desire. Now, let me be absolutely clear with this. It is not a sin to divorce for sexual immorality. Jesus gives that clause. Jesus himself says this is the clause. And God is understanding if one party is particularly refusing fidelity. When you have a situation where someone is just committed to breaking down the covenant relationship, God is very understanding that you can put away that spouse who is committed to that infidelity. But it is not his desire for marriage. His desire in marriage is faithfulness, forgiveness, and restoration. When we look at marriage today, we see that marriage today is perhaps even viewed lighter than the Pharisees took it. Perhaps viewed in a way that's even less significant than it was in Jesus' day. D.A. Carson said that love has become a mixture of physical desire and vague sentimentality. Marriage has become a provisional sexual union to be terminated when this pathetic, shrunken love dissolves. That's the view of marriage in today's world. It's just based on this physical desire and vague sentimentality. And as soon as that's gone, as soon as that desire is out of there, then it's like, all right, well, let's cut this off. Let's break apart the union. Jesus views marriage much higher than that. He views it as something significant, something sacred, something unchanging. God gave us the gift of marriage in the book of Genesis, and he gave it to us as an inseparable bond. As we look at the scriptures that deal with marriage, let us not think, what's the exception to my fidelity? What's the exception? Under what circumstances can I get out of this union? Rather, let us look at our commitment, especially if we're in the marriage circumstance right now. Let us look at our commitment and ask ourselves instead, how can we protect ourselves from infidelity? How can we make sure this doesn't happen? Because it happens all the time. As we discussed this last week, people don't just fall into adultery. They either make a series of bad decisions and put themselves in circumstances to commit adultery, or they're just making a high-handed decision that I'm going to break the covenant promise that I made to my spouse. People don't just fall into it. What we need to do is ask ourselves, how do we protect ourselves from it? We need to cut it off before it even starts. Be careful about the company that we keep. Be careful of potentially compromising circumstances. Communicate your needs and make your best effort to fulfill the needs of your spouse. And as we discussed last week, guard yourself from lust of any kind. Protect yourself from these things. And rather than deal with how do I get out of this relationship under certain circumstances, and rather ask, how can I protect this relationship at all costs? Seek in all ways and under all circumstances to keep the commitment that you made in marriage. So that's divorce. And Jesus continues really along the same lines. As he's just dealt with the fact that you need to keep the commitment that you made, he then moves on to the next section. We go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. The interpretation of the law as Jesus gives it, he doesn't give a direct quotation of the law, but rather he gives the general understanding of a few Old Testament passages. If we look at Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 12. You shall not swear falsely by my name so as to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. A few other passages there. We look at Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2. Numbers 30 and verse 2 says, if a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. And finally, Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 12. Deuteronomy 23 and verse 12 says, you shall also have... No, that's not it. 24 verse 12. No, that's all right. We'll just deal with the first two. Leviticus 19:12 and Numbers chapter 30 verse 2. Deuteronomy 23:21. Deuteronomy 23:21 says, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it will be a sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. The law is simple on this matter. If you make an oath, keep it. Right? You make an oath, keep it. Very, very simple. Again, notice in these texts, making a vow is not a command. There are not circumstances under the Old Testament where you're told, you need to make a vow to make sure this happens. Or you need to make a vow when defending yourself in a court situation. Basically, it says it's not a command, but a provision. He says, if you make an oath, under the circumstances that you make an oath, then make it in God's name. And if you're going to make it in God's name, you need to keep it. So if you make an oath, make that oath in God's name and keep that oath. Basically what the Pharisees had done in the interpretation of this law is they'd developed specific formulae for oaths to determine if they count or not, if they're binding or not. And basically, if you didn't use the correct formula, then you're not bound by the oath. What they'd say is, if you swear by Jerusalem, you're not bound by the oath. But if you swear toward Jerusalem, then you are bound by the oath. Or if you swear by the temple, you're not bound. But if you swear by the gold in the temple, then you are bound to keep that oath. Basically what they'd done is they'd taken the swearing of oaths, which was really what it's meant to be, is a way to ensure and foster honesty. It actually ended up promoting lying. The swearing of oaths degenerated into rules to justify their deceit, ways that I can get around it, that I can say, I swear by Jerusalem, and then when it comes back to bite me and said, I swear by Jerusalem, not toward Jerusalem, so it doesn't count. I'm allowed to lie under those circumstances. And again, let's put ourselves in the shoes of this culture. Let's put ourselves in the circumstance that we're in this culture, and someone makes an oath to you. What's your immediate thought? If someone makes an oath to you, my immediate thought would be, is this a real oath or a fake oath? Are they just using this as something to get out of this? I don't know the formula. The formulas weren't written down at this point in Jesus' life. In this culture, making an oath would cause people to immediately become skeptical of your honesty. If you make an oath, people are thinking, I'm actually more skeptical of your honesty now than I was before you made the oath, because I don't know the formula. I don't know what's binding and what's not binding. The way Jesus presents this in response, from verse 34, but I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Jesus basically turns this around and he says, every possible oath you can make comes back to God anyway. Even if you're swearing by your own head, You can control your head, it's your head, but God ultimately has control over it. God is the one who can make your hair white or black. God has control. He's saying it doesn't matter what you swear by. The formula of the oath is completely superfluous. It doesn't matter. Jesus expounds upon this further in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 16 to 22. It reads there, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, 'Whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated.' You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering on the altar, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears by both the altar and everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." Every oath you make has to do with God. Doesn't matter what you swear on, it's coming back to God. You must keep the oath if you make an oath. Jesus is saying the formula is completely irrelevant. The clear intention of the law is that God's people keep their promises and are people of their word. And if that's the case, if that's the intention of the law, then oaths are unnecessary. What's the point of an oath? If you are known as people who keep your promises, people of your word, then the oath itself becomes unnecessary. So what Jesus says, make no oath at all. Just don't make an oath. Instead, in verse 37, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. Jesus said that oaths ought to be avoided altogether, especially in a culture when making an oath simply looks like someone evading responsibility, simply looks like someone who's trying to get away with deceit. More than that, in verse 37, Jesus wants us to live in such a way that our word is as firm as an oath. That if I say yes, then you know I mean yes. If I say no, you know I mean no. That my word is as good as an oath. Being men and women of our word has a dramatic effect on how people view us. I once knew this guy. I met him when I was in high school, and whatever they told me, anything that they would tell me, doesn't matter the topic, doesn't matter what it was dealing with, anything they told me, I would immediately assume the opposite to be true. They had given me such a reason to not trust them that if they told me something, then I would immediately assume that the opposite is actually the case. And especially if they were accompanying with it with oaths or accompanying with it with this extra insurance. Like, no, dude, trust me on this one. Trust me on this one. Well, now I know it's not true, right? Being men and women of our word has a dramatic effect on how people view us. But more than that, being men and women of deceit will have a extremely negative impact on the way people view us. How are people going to trust us when we tell them about Christ, when they can't trust us in the simple telling of the truth, in the simple speaking the truth? It's a sad way to look at someone, and even more so to look at a Christian that way. The Essenes, who are a Jewish sect at the time when Jesus was around, they shared this view. They believed that swearing an oath is worse than perjury. What they said was, he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. That was the view of the Essenes. Anyone who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. So if you meet someone and you can't trust them and you say, well, swear by God and then I'll believe you. Well, that person's already condemned because they've proved themselves dishonest. They've proved themselves as not people of integrity, because otherwise you'd be able to take them at their word without the oath. Christians today ought to be known for our honesty and our integrity. And sadly, this isn't the case. Sadly, as we look at mainstream Christianity, we often see as much corruption and deceit as we see in the world. As we look at what the world views as Christianity, we see corruption, we see deceit. We don't see people living by honesty and living by their word. Instead of being recognized for our integrity, people are seemingly more suspicious of Christians. I remember this one time I said, I really can't remember the circumstance. I think it was like trying to borrow something of someone. And someone was really skeptical about whether or not I'd give it back. And I was like, dude, I'm a Christian. Of course I'm going to do that. And he said, that doesn't help. I've known Christians before, so I know that doesn't help your case. What a sad way that people view the church today. What a sad way that people view Christians. This is a perception that we desperately need to change, at least in our own corner of the world, at least here in our community. If people say, oh, these people go to Gipps Street, I know we can trust them. These people are members of the Church of Christ, I know we can trust them. Let us strive to be known personally and corporately for our honesty and our integrity. In a world that values exaggeration, stand out from the world by speaking the plain and simple truth. I've been looking at houses lately, looking around to purchase a house, and been dealing with real estate agents. They love exaggeration, right? They love to tell you how they'll take something bad about the house and they'll spin it and say, oh, it's not tiny, it's cozy, or something like that. In a world that values exaggeration, stand out from the world by speak the plain and simple truth. Let us ask ourselves, look at our own lives and look at our own history. Do we have any unfulfilled promises? Do we look at any promises in my own life, commitments that I've made that I haven't kept? We need to ask ourselves, what can I do to fulfill that? If I've made a promise, if I've told someone I'm going to do something, then I need to work on being a man of my word and being a man of honesty and integrity. In both divorce and oaths, as Christians, we keep our commitments. We conduct ourselves with integrity. Be careful not to make a commitment to do something that you're not sure that you can do. If you're thinking about entering into the marriage relationship, don't get married if being hurt or disappointed will cause you to break your commitment. Know that you will be hurt, you will be disappointed. But you know that you are going to make that commitment knowing that you keep your word, that you are an individual of integrity and commitment. Don't put your word to something that you're not confident that you can fulfill. Jesus calls his followers to a high standard of commitment, fidelity, and integrity. And Jesus is not asking anything from you that he has not fulfilled himself. Because he made a commitment to you. He made a commitment to you and he paid the ultimate sacrifice for that commitment. He died on the cross to make that commitment to you. And as we look at our own lives, we know that we haven't been faithful to that commitment. We haven't kept that commitment. We haven't always been honest with God. We haven't always kept the things that we said we were going to keep. We fall short of that. And he continues to keep his word to us with honesty, integrity, commitment, and fidelity. Let's be upstanding as we sing the final song.